Welcome back to the Energy Sovereignty Project and to the studio. It's good to be back in the plaid shirt again here with you guys. So for those of you that have been waiting for more of these Energy Sovereignty Project closeout videos, thank you very much for sticking with us. Obviously, we've had some trials and tribulations with the viral outbreak that we've had here, and I hope that you and yours are happy and healthy wherever you are out there. We're going to try and get these videos out on a more regular basis. Obviously, we have all of the information that we need now to be able to compile these videos, and it's just now a case of just getting the videos out to you. And so we'll try and make that happen. We have a couple interesting ones lined up, driving on sunlight, a few others. This video here is on the system's efficiency. In other words, how much loss did we actually see over the course of the year? I'm going to try and keep these videos down to about 20 minutes or so. So let's get to it, because we've got a lot to cover in this one. Okay, like I said, this recap is going to focus on our system losses. But I want to start off by talking about two losses that we really don't have any direct control over, but they will dictate how we size our systems and how we choose our equipment. So the first two losses, if we'll call them that, are basically the efficiencies of the system. So the first one you have is the efficiency of the panel itself. That's a product of how much power you get from the panel as opposed to how large that panel actually is. And so in our case, we have a format of 1,685 millimeters by 1,000 millimeters, and that gives us a panel efficiency, a rough panel efficiency of 18.4%, just under 19%. Panels that are available today will do a little better than that. You might wind up having a little better than a 20% efficiency. And at the very end of the video, we'll talk a little bit about how solar roof tiles kind of relate to that. Solar roof tiles are a bit of a different animal, and so they are going to require us to take a look at a couple of issues that involve them specifically. So for this, we're just going to focus on the panels themselves, the standard solar panels. So like I said, in our case, we have 310 watt panels that are 1685 by 1000. The ratings for these panels, the way that they get that wattage is related to basically a virtual sunlight standard that they use for these tests. And so pull this data sheet real quick. If you look in the lower left of this data sheet, what you see here is that 1,000 watts per square meter. So that's basically a sunlight equivalent. And what that does is it allows you to be able to compare panels from one manufacturer to another and be able to understand that relative power between the outputs of those two panels. If they didn't have this kind of a standard, then there would be way too much wiggle room for them to be able to, for the consumer to be able to then compare those two panels. So that's basically what that is. It's just a benchmark rating that we can use to then judge one panel against another. So that said, now the second part of this is how close to reality is that 1,000 watts per square meter. And so for that, what we have to look at is data that's collected as far as how much sunlight is actually hitting the planet. And so we have a couple of interesting screenshots for that. When sunlight hits the surface of a sphere, sorry flat earthers, when sunlight hits the surface of a sphere, you wind up having a distribution of that power. And so we have this is courtesy of NASA's Langley Atmospheric Research Center, and what this is a distribution according to latitude, showing what how the sunlight is distributed, again through nothing but latitude. But that's of limited help to us. What we really are interested in is what they did next. And what they did next was this. They pointed that same sensor set at the ground to see what the relationship was between the amount of sunlight that was hitting the ground and cloud cover, the actual amount that was hitting the ground. Now when you look at those areas there that are deep red, those areas are actually producing a little more than 1,000 watts per square meter. You wind up with about 1,050 watts per square meter or so. But when you look at those areas that are yellowish and greenish and where the red fades, that's where you're starting to look at some fall off. And so you're not actually going to get that full 1,000 watts per square meter. Well, what are you going to get? Well, if you happen to have a solar tracking system, or if you have a home that has a roof that happens to have all its panels optimum, or you end up having a separate set of solar arrays that are optimized as far as their direction, then you'll probably do a little bit better than most. But are you going to get that full 1,000 watts per square meter? Probably not. Probably not. Now, when I have people size their systems, a pretty good benchmark to use is about a 20% loss or 20% reduction in what your panels are rated at. So again, we'll go off of a 10 kilowatt hypothetical installation on your roof. You're going to wind up getting around 8 kilowatts of power. And the reason for that is, again, most homes will have a fixed panel array on their roof. Some of those panels might not be pointed in the optimal direction, maybe none of them. Again, it's going to vary quite a bit house to house. It's also going to obviously vary, like we saw, region to region on the planet. So again, your mileage may vary. And so all of these things you should probably take into account, but 20% reduction is a pretty good benchmark. And again, that's something that your solar provider will be honest with you about, hopefully, when they install the system and let you know what type of a reduction that you'll wind up having. If they aren't upfront with that, ask them and then see what you can come up with. But here's the annoying part. The annoying part is that the utility providers, they don't care. They're going to hold you to that bench rating no matter what. Their goal is to try and make sure that you don't generate all the power that you need. They want you to generate about 90% of the power that you need, and if they can use this to leverage that and make that happen so that you at least continue to buy some power, then that's exactly what they're going to do. And so the reason that I'm telling you about these two is that maybe you'll be able to use that information as a consumer to create some kind of leverage against your utility provider, or maybe that your solar installer can make that argument on your behalf, showing the utility provider how your installation has gone. But will you have any luck with that? Don't know. Good luck. All I can say is that throughout the U.S., each utility district is very different one from another. And I have no idea how they deal with this in Canada, in the UK, or in Australia, or Europe. So for any of our subscribers that are in those areas, please feel free to leave a comment and let us know what your relationship is with your utility provider. Have they been pushing back on how much power that you install on your roof? So we'll get back to that kind of when we close this all out. But moving on, now let's start talking about some losses that you do actually have some control over. And the very first thing that we get to on the path from the solar panels to your system is your inverter. Now, in our case, we chose a Solar Edge inverter, and they're fairly efficient. So we'll go ahead and pull up that data sheet for them real quick here. And in the case of the Energy Sovereignty Project, like I said, we have a single Solar Edge 7.6 kilowatt inverter. And when you look at the data sheet here, what you will see is that it's got a maximum efficiency of 99.2. Now, they were careful to use the term maximum efficiency here because what they're not really telling you fully is that at lower power levels, when the system is coming up in the morning or when it's operating in winter, you have some reduction, and there will usually be a data sheet associated with each individual inverter type. But let me pull up just a general one real quick here. So here we've got a efficiency curve for several different inverters. And what you notice here is, if you look along the bottom, that's the percentage of output, and then along the top is how much fall off you have in percentage. So in other words, you have that Siemens at 20 kilowatts. One would be a 20 kilowatt input to that inverter, and then obviously 50 would be a 10 kilowatt, and you get the idea for how that goes. But what you'll see here is that when you get down to about 20% of any given inverter input, you wind up seeing some fall off. And that's what we're going to wind up looking at here just briefly about sizing your inverters. So let's pull up a couple of things that our SolarEdge data sheet says about sizing. Here is where they're referring to what they call oversizing the inverter. Now, it's odd that they call this oversizing. What they really mean is undersizing. In other words, what we have done, where we know that our system is going to produce 8 kilowatts of power. And when we were trying to size our inverter, we would have liked to have gotten an 8 kilowatt inverter, but one wasn't available, and so we went with a 7.6. If they had made an 8, then we would have gone with that. The problem with going with a 10 is, again, back to that fall off in that data sheet. I didn't want to run the system in its lower regions for longer periods during winter. I thought that since 7.6 was very close to what we were going to wind up seeing as our peak, that anything that we would lose off of that peak by clipping would be more than made up for by the increased efficiency of the operation of the inverter at lower power levels. And let's show a little bit of how that works here. So here we have two screenshots. One is from June 10th and the other is from December. And what you'll see, obviously, first off, is that they're different sizes. Well, they're not actually. What I've done, if you look, is I've squished them so that they're the same scale. And this highlights the issue here. The inverter is only running at that 99.2% efficiency here at the top. And now, when you start to see the shorter peaks in winter, these are the areas here where I would like it to produce more power, more efficient power. And this is when you see the system starting up in the morning, and also more of its operational envelope in winter. Well, I hope that helped to kind of clear things up rather than to add to anyone's confusion. But all of those selections that we made as far as which panels we're going to have and the selection of the inverter, that's all basically on the front side. In other words, converting that sunlight to usable power. Now we have the power. Now let's go ahead and see how efficiently we're able to actually use that to affect our daily lives. And so when we move forward here, now we're in a point where we have the incoming power able to be monitored several different ways. Now, the first way is through the inverter itself. We have a monitoring system set up so that SolarEdge can actually monitor each individual panel separately, so that if we wind up having a panel fault, that gets reported to us immediately, and so that's very handy to have. The other thing that monitors the system, obviously, is the Tesla gateway. That acts as the go-between to decide where that power is going to go. And then, obviously, we have the utility companies themselves that monitor the power. Now, with the utility companies, we wind up getting a longer resolution period on that. In other words, we don't get feedback from them as far as how much power we sent to them or used until the end of the month, until the end of the billing period. Whereas the SolarEdge inverter and the Tesla gateway give us a hourly resolution. We can actually look and see moment to moment how much power we're actually creating. And so that's a neat thing to look at. But we have a bit of a problem there, and this is what I was noticing. So this is June 10th again, just to kind of keep things on that day. This is our log entry just for a little bit of fun. The reason that we're using June 10th is because it was a high production day. This gives us a lot of input into the system so that we can better judge what our losses are, what it might be going on. And so here is the Solar Edge printout for June 10th. And what you can see here is that we have created 61.61 kilowatt hours of power according to the inverters. Well, when we pull up Tesla's gateway information for the same day, you see that they're showing that we created 60 kilowatts even. And so did we lose 1.61 kilowatt hours? It doesn't seem so, because now going back to the inverter and seeing what it shows us for the month, we have this. And the inverter is showing that we created 1.89 megawatt hours for the month. And so then our sanity check for that becomes, what did it say on our bill? And what our bill said was, that line item there, 1.893 total PV generation. And so then that winds up lining up exactly with what our inverter said. And what does Tesla say? Well, Tesla says 1.841 megawatt hours for the month. And that's a difference of 52 kilowatt hours. And that comes out to a daily average of 1.73 kilowatt hours per day of disparity. And when we look at the daily numbers again, we see that this is also perfectly in line with what our daily difference shows, almost down to the light bulb level of resolution. And so this was my first hurdle here. What's my margin of error when I'm trying to calculate out our losses? What's going on here? So Tesla seems to have a small but not insignificant calibration error. Now I'm not sure how one goes about correcting this. It's not much of an error, but it does represent 2.7% of, what do we call this, of phantom loss, right? And so the issue here is that from this point on, we're going to be dealing strictly with data that we got from the Tesla gateway. So to deal with that, I'm going to make the assumption that all of Tesla's numbers are equally skewed, hopefully. And what we're going to do is that we'll use those numbers to figure out what our percentage of loss is. We won't focus as much on the actual numbers in the content as we will on the percentage of difference. And then that will give us a real world evaluation of how well our system did. So, moving on. So let's start off with this by looking at the year in overview. And so starting with the basics, what we see here is that we generated 14,164 kilowatt hours, and the home used 13,377 kilowatt hours. And so this initially tells us that we produced 787 kilowatt hours more than we used. So why did we get a bill? Well, this is where untangling these numbers gets interesting and a little confusing if you don't know what to look for. And so I've seen folks make the mistake of looking at the to the grid number, where you've got the 800 and pull this up here real quick while we're talking about it. You've got the to the grid number of 894 kilowatt hours in our case, and they're trying to make a correlation between the PV generation and the home usage. And a common mistake is then that they'll add that 894 of excess solar to the 13,377 that was used and come up with that 14,000 number for comparison. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. If it was that easy, I suppose we wouldn't need a video on it. But let's take a look at why that doesn't work and what the real losses are. And to do that, first we're going to have to break it down. We have a legitimate 14,164 kilowatt hours of production. And so again, using Tesla's numbers here for the sake of simplicity, I know that we actually produced a little more than that, but again, we're going to break this down to percentages, and so we'll be fine with that. But where did the power go? And so of the power that we created from solar, it took 3 different avenues of travel. It can either be produced and used directly by the home, no loss, or it can be produced and sent out to the grid, again, no loss. They record it as accurately as they can as it goes out, and then they wind up crediting you for that amount of kilowatt hours. Again, in your area, depending on how you have net metering, getting that back obviously may mean that you have some loss of revenue, but the amount that goes out is 0 loss. And then the third avenue it can take is it can go into the power walls, and then you will wind up suffering some amount of loss from going into the power wall and back out again. And so to untangle this, we are going to have to do something a little counterintuitive. And we're going to look at what I'm going to call the home's solar responsibility. So let's pull this up real quick. And that is to say the amount of power that the home actually got from solar. So what we'll do to get that is we're going to subtract the amount that we took from the grid, and we're going to find that then the home actually got 11,987 kilowatt hours from solar. Okay. Now, we can look at that 894 kilowatt hours that we sent to the grid now, because we've just stripped it out of the home use by subtracting it, right? And so we can add that back into the solar side, because again, it represents that non-loss power generation that came from that can track as coming from the solar PV system. And so now that we did that, we find that we can account for 12,881 kilowatt hours of our total production of 14,164. So what we wind up seeing now is that we have a total loss of 1,283 kilowatt hours. Okay, so where did it go? Before we reveal that, I want to take one quick look at why we had to send that 894 kilowatt hours of power to the grid in the first place, because it's kind of important. When we look back again at our year in review, you see these gray lines where it drops below the bottom there. Now that represents times when the batteries are full and we're exporting significant amounts of power out to the grid. Now, in a perfect world, one might imagine a battery so large that you'd be able to actually store that power for a year and distribute it out in winter. But the reality is that you're never going to have that make any sense. It's just impractical to think in those terms. And even if one were to have a larger battery, say at the community level or even at the state level, it still wouldn't be able to take care of this particular issue, because again, you're overproducing in periods of time that are too far distant from when you're actually going to be pulling that back out. And we'll talk a little bit as we close up here about how to solve that issue, that gap issue. But I just want folks to get into their mind that this is part of doing business, that you ultimately have an upper limit to how much battery capacity you're going to wind up having at your home. And that's going to be obviously dictated by electric vehicle driving and the size of your home, size of your PV system, that kind of a thing. So just keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to it as we close out this video. Now, moving on, we're going to take a look at how you calculate out the total losses between what went into the Powerwall and then what came back out of it. And let's start off by thinking a little bit about imagining if we didn't have any batteries at all, how much power would we be looking at? How much went into the battery system as opposed to being consumed by the home right away? And it gets a little annoying here again, because initially Tesla listed the in and out of the Powerwall on the weekly, monthly, and annual numbers. They still listed on the daily numbers, but it's now a little more difficult for everybody to pull out those numbers unless you're doing what we did and log those numbers on a daily basis. So why are they doing that? It might be because they're not proud of that fact that you wind up losing, 10% plus from what goes into the Powerwall to what comes back out. But it is a number that they should be showing the customer, because even though you don't have much of a control over it, as you'll find out, you do have a little bit of control over it. So Tesla, if you're listening, go ahead and put that back in your app, because it's useful information. So even though, as you see here, when you look at the totals for 2019, that you'll notice that the Powerwall number is gone. We are the Energy Sovereignty Project, and because we kept track of all of that, we're going to just put it back. Now this is pretty cool. We actually sent over half of our production to the batteries to be pulled back out later. What this means is that over the course of the year, if we add what was sent to the battery and what was sent to the grid together, we would have sent 9,742 kilowatts, nearly 10 megawatts to the grid. Now, in our case, we have net metering, and so at least we do for now. But I hope you can all clearly see that there is absolutely no hope that the grid could withstand this kind of use if everybody was doing this. It's simply not scalable. So the only solution here as we move forward to a 21st century power grid solution is to have local batteries do what we see here. Either it's going to have to be batteries, like we said, somewhere in the local community or inside the home itself. And now that we have the amount of power that we sent to the Powerwalls restored, now we can finish up our loss calculations. So, over the course of the year, we put 8,848 kilowatt hours into the battery, and we retrieved 7,420 kilowatt hours, and that gives us a yearly loss of 1,428 kilowatt hours. So, not too bad, really. We have as a percentage, that winds up coming out to about 16% overall efficiency, and while the rated round-trip efficiency of the Powerwalls was supposed to be 10%, so what happened to that additional 6%? Did Tesla lie about the round-trip efficiency? No, the round-trip efficiency is actually 10%. That was something that we exhaustively tested as soon as we got hold of the Powerwall batteries, as soon as they were installed. And when we did our round-trip assessment, we were putting power into the Powerwalls and then drawing that power back out immediately and then measuring that as best we could. And it came out basically dead nuts on 10%. And so, to understand what happened to that additional 6%, we go back to that whole thing of it's the cost of doing business, really. And so remember, our goal was to get to a point where we use the grid as little as possible, either pulling power from it or sending power to it. The additional 6% loss that we see here was the result of allowing power to just sit in the batteries. Now, we didn't do this very often, obviously, but for those of you that are following the Energy Sovereignty Project, you know that from time to time the system did get to 100% or nearly so and was left at that high rate of charge. The main reason we did that was in our shoulder periods, where we wanted to get past prolonged periods of stormy weather. So that's one reason one would do that. And equally, you can imagine the reserve system on your setting during days when the home is largely using grid power, in winter and what have you, where you have a limited amount of solar contribution, but at least part of that solar contribution is then devoted to just keeping your batteries at that reserve level, because there is a little bit of loss over time. Now that loss gets a little worse when we look at our final condition, and that is when you have the batteries full, no place else to put the power, and you're still cranking. Well, when the battery charges in those periods, the fans come on, you've got the coolant loop coming on, and so you have some increased losses that go along with storage of that power, in addition to all the normal housekeeping that goes on, because these batteries actually are designed to shift power around from module to module so that no one module gets over fatigued, overused, and so then over time that winds up greatly lengthening the longevity of the batteries. And so that's where that that additional 6% goes. So let's take a last look at the loss calculation for the Powerwalls. We're going to tune up a couple of things. So You'll recall from our calculations before that we were actually missing 1,283 kilowatt hours of power when we did our back calculations for what was missing before. Now, for those that have been following the Energy Sovereignty Project, you know that from September till the end of the year, we were suffering a software fault that caused something that I refer to as rogue charging. And aside from StormWatch, which we also used a couple of times, let me just kind of test it out and show how that works, the system would occasionally just lose its mind and all of a sudden take a whole bunch of power from the grid. And before I could get back in to turn it off or until the batteries were full, it would charge again off of the grid. This power went directly to the power walls and it didn't come from solar. And so if we look at the difference between our two measured numbers, we've come up with that there's a difference of 145 kilowatt hours that without going back to the logs, that sounds pretty close to the exact number that we wound up pulling out through a combination of those rogue charges and also the StormWatch that we used. Now, that said, regardless of where that power came from, we still did lose it. And so, for the sake of keeping everything honest, we're going to go ahead and keep the 1,428 kilowatt hour loss number because, again, we lost that power. And so was our total system loss over the course of the year 16.1%? Close, but not quite. Our final calculation, you have to remember that the power that we sent straight to the home for immediate use and the power that we sent straight out to the grid, that was lossless. And so we need to account for that. And so what we see here now, we have nearly exactly a 10% loss of solar power overall when compared to the system as a whole. And so in your own cases, try to best monitor your batteries to see how you might more efficiently use the power that you create and then have to store. One of the things that I can see assisting that would be in winter, unless you need the power for powering an electric vehicle, it might be to your benefit to actually turn off a certain number of your power walls so that then you aren't losing the power that's in them. Maybe charge them up to, I don't know, 60, 70%, and then just turn them off so that they're not being worked and suffering additional losses. This is also something that Tesla might be able to do at a later date. They're also talking a great deal about controlling the batteries from a grid level, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up here with one final loss, if you can call it that, and we're going to place the blame for having to draw from the grid at all. I'm going to place that on what I'm going to refer to as production loss or roof loss. And that is the difference between what we see here and the amount of power that we sent to the grid and the amount of power that we had to use at all. And ultimately, I would love to get that number to be zero, that we pulled absolutely nothing from the grid. So here's the problem. This is the roof of the Energy Sovereignty Project home. Now, ultimately, my desire would have been to have a solar producing roof tile on every square inch of that roof that isn't in complete shadow, as you see it in this image here. Now, the argument to that is that it might be cost prohibitive to do that, and if that is the case, then that's something that companies like Tesla need to work on to make sure that that is an affordable solution. If the argument is that it's a design issue, then that's also something that companies like Tesla need to wind up working on to make it possible. If we're going to move forward in a sustainable future, we need to stop fooling around with these systems. We really do need to make sure that we can have each home producing the maximum amount that it can and storing the maximum amount that's reasonable for whatever that homeowner's situation is. Now, Tesla's currently working on solving this with a test of what they're calling Auto Bidder. Now, this is software that's currently, I believe, available just in Australia, but don't quote me on that. I think they're going to be making it widely available to others as well. And what Auto Bidder does is it allows you to shop the available power that you have to the grid. So instead of building peaker plants and what have you, that the grid will then be able to say, hey, you know, we see that these Tesla Powerwall customers have a aggregate amount of power that they've said that we have access to. And again, that'll be something that you'll set on your Powerwall app. You'll be able to tell them how much power they're allowed to draw out at any given time. And by this, then the power companies will be able to leverage that power that you've stored and hopefully pay you a premium for it, because again, you're saving them money. They didn't have to build those additional power plants just so that you would be able to then allow them to borrow some of your power, and then they then put it back, and there you go. But that doesn't really seem to be Tesla's current difficulty. Now, back to the solar roof that we mentioned in the very beginning of this. I'll try to make this quick so this video doesn't trail on too much. But they've got a problem right now with their solar roof installations. And in speaking with two people now that have been on the early program to get solar roofs on their homes, they're both basically saying the same thing, and that is that Tesla is currently trying to limit the amount of power that they're allowing them to install on their roof. As crazy as that sounds. Now, this does seem to be a availability issue, and so we'll go ahead and go with that for now rather than anything more nefarious. But part of that thing that they're doing right now is they're saying that they're installing 5,000 roofs a week. Well, that's great, but I would be more impressed to learn that they're doing a certain number of solar production a week rather than trying to say that so many people were satisfied. So there may be a supply issue with these, and there may also be an engineering issue with these, because both of these individuals have said that they had to severely limit the amount of producing panel coverage on their roof because the panels required a certain border around these producing panels. And that, along with the fact that they're not a terribly efficient panel, made it so that even if you were to cover the maximum amount of roof surface with these panels, you still would be looking at a roof that might only be able to produce a little bit more than if you had used standard panels. And again, obviously standard panels, they're larger, and so they're not as conforming to the roof structure. But remember, we talked about that cell efficiency versus the modular efficiency. And all of that is going to be measured against what? 1,000 watts per square meter. And so when you start to apply that to the solar roof, it seems like the solar roof comes up a little bit short. Now again, I look forward to seeing some comments on that to see what your own experiences are. Hopefully somebody watching this actually has one of these solar roofs, and so they can tell me a little bit about what their overall production is. That would be fantastic. But for now, we'll just go ahead and close that out here. We're entering a new era where the demand as we move forward into a 21st century power grid and usage, we're going to be adding electric vehicles to this mix in huge numbers. And the amount of power that is then going to require as we transition away from fossil fuels is something that is going to have to be addressed at the home level. And the producers, the companies that are making the equipment, they're already cranking. Tesla is doing a fantastic job at making sure that the efficiencies go up. I'm sure they're working on the solar roof to make the solar roof better. But we are being just pummeled by the utility companies and their lobbyists. we are limited by the utility companies as to how much power we can actually install on the roof. When what they should be saying is, all right, Junior, you've went and put 20 kilowatts of solar producing tiles on your roof. We're only going to allow you to then send X amount to the grid because you have lost your mind, or we're just not looking at needing that much power during the summer. And so that's fine. Go ahead and throttle those systems down in the summer and throttle them back up in the winter. And so that 20 kilowatts or so of solar producing tiles that you have on your roof are actually meeting your home's needs in winter. And that is where we get back to that whole, why did we draw power from the grid at all, and how can we avoid it? Well, that's how we can avoid it. But we're going to have to get the utility companies past this notion that people actually have to buy power. And to do that, it's going to take a combined effort with all of you guys. I will continue to do my part. For your part, try and bend the ear of your representatives. No matter where you are, what country you are, make sure that they hear you loud and clear, that you don't want to be limited by the public utilities as to how much power you can actually have on the roof of your home. So I hope you found that interesting. The losses are 10%, almost exactly 10%. And so I found that to be quite refreshing and well within what I think would be reasonable for what we've managed to accomplish for the year. And I wish you the best of luck with your own systems, and we will see you again soon with more of these closeout videos.